Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Today's topic has nothing to do with Frankenstein for those of you who are currently confused by the image you can see. No, we are definitely talking about Session 0 for Dungeons and Dragons or for any kind of roleplay game, but because most people who are watching my channel are playing Dungeons and Dragons, I'm really going to relate the discussion back to Dungeons & Dragons 5e rather than talk about other versions of Dungeons & Dragons or a different roleplay game for those of you who are kind of curious as to how I was going to approach this. So what is Session 0? Session 0 is all about just setting up the game and the group before your Dungeons & Dragons game, before you even sit down and play the game. And yes, in some cases during your Session 0 near the end, there may be an opportunity to sit down and play for a short period of time. But the concept behind Session 0 is not so much about playing the game, but developing something else. And I'm going to spell it out as clear as I can. You don't have to agree with me, but I honestly think and believe that I have found that long-term Dungeons & Dragons campaigns are so much better with a Session 0. And it doesn't matter whether I am the Dungeon Master or I am a player. I've always found that to be the case. The key reason for any kind of Session 0 is developing a healthy relationship between the people, the players, and the Dungeon Master. I know a lot of people get confused when I say this sort of thing. It has nothing really to do with creating a marvelous adventure or even sitting down and building characters. Certainly you will be doing that, but the exercise and process is about team building. For those of you who are confused by that, that is the focus. Session 0 prevents and helps avoid issues at the game table. This is why I do them. It's not because of any other reason really. It's really around making sure that the group is really healthy and working well and they understand each other, so you don't have to ask some sort of question from a complete stranger on the internet for advice on problems that occur at your table. And yes, I'm talking about every single YouTuber there is, including WebDM, which of course I know a lot of people watch, including myself. So what do you cover in a Session 0? Well, the first thing I would say is you're going to start off with just setting the groundwork. And the groundwork usually starts with what sort of adventure or game does everybody want to play. That's not just the players, that's the Dungeon Master as well. You have a say in the process. And a lot of this discussion will involve a chat weeks ahead of time before Session 0. It might be months ahead of time. I actually spent months before I ran my current campaign talking with my players, getting an idea of what they wanted out of the game before we even sat down and started having our Session 0. That was my first key point. Then I would say go to Dungeon Master expectations. What does the Dungeon Master expect from the players and the process of running the game and playing the game? I tend to focus on things like fun. I want to have fun. I want everybody else to have fun. I want there to be teamwork taking place. And I'm really selfish. I want the players to make my life easier rather than create problems for me by any means they can think of. And there's a really broad aspect to that. My concern is always about the integrity of the group rather than other aspects. I don't really care about the rest. I just care about the integrity and how well and healthy the group functions. The next thing, you want to sit down and have a discussion with your players, and I tend to do this almost every single time. I will ask each player individually. You do not have to do it this way though. Player expectations are really good to discuss. So this could be their play style, what they like playing, and are they a slayer? Do they like to just engage in combat? Are they more an actor and like to just role play and play out the character? Are they more about puzzles? Are things like solving problems more their thing? There's usually a lot of different play styles. I've done a video on the topic. I'm not going to talk about it again. You're welcome to go and check that out if you want to. There's also the adventure focus. Are you going to focus on combat, social interactions, or exploration, or is there going to be a mixture of that? My current group decided they wanted everything. They wanted combat, they wanted social interactions, and they wanted exploration. So nothing was going to be put to the side. So that's fine with me. We'll live with that. The other thing with regard to player expectations that I find really important to make sure you establish, and that is talk to people and find out what they think is fun. Because some people's idea of fun is quite sick, and then other people's idea of fun is perfectly fine. So it's really good to establish those things before you have everybody sitting down at the table and suddenly you discover that people's way of playing the game is just not going to work. So have that discussion ahead of time. The location where people will play the game is decided. Now that could be online. I don't know, it could be any platform. You might be using Fantasy Grounds, Roll20. You might be playing your game at a game store. You might be playing your game at a cafeteria or a cafe, which is in fact what my group did. This is the picture I'm showing you right now. Or you might go over to somebody else's house and sit down in their lounge or in their basement and play the game. So decide on a location. You might have a couple of different options depending on how things work out during the week. Next, get people to commit to a consistent time and day. Make sure you try to pick a time and a day that generally will work for everybody. Now, there's no guarantee that everybody can show up all the time, but you need to have some sort of general consensus about what's going to work. Does the group meet weekly or fortnightly or monthly? Have that established. What can people fit into their busy life and their work life? How do you deal with absent players? If there's an absent player, does somebody else play that character? Or does the Dungeon Master? Personally, as a Dungeon Master, I hate playing somebody's character. I won't do it. No, it's not going to happen. If the player who has a character says, I would like so-and-so Bob or Jill to play my character, and I'm quite happy for whatever outcome occurs, then I'm all good with that. So those discussions need to be made. When does the game get cancelled? And I generally don't like the idea of cancelling a game just because one person is missing. I usually have a couple of backups. If I don't have backups, I have a large enough group that it doesn't matter if we lose a couple of players. If we have less than 3 players and we wind up with 2 players, I cancel my game. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I operate. So establish those things ahead of time. Really important to determine how character death is managed at your game table. Now, if there's no way that the group can figure out how to bring their character back, they haven't got spells, they don't have the resources to do that, how is it going to take place? Are they going to have to roll up and make a new character, or will the Dungeon Master use the huge arsenal of options available to them to bring the character back into the game? People already know how I view character death. I don't really worry too much about it. I will use lots of different options. I'm happy to do that. So that's a discussion that I will have with my players with regard to character death. So make sure you talk about that. And I know a lot of people think, well, we shouldn't need to worry about those sorts of things. We don't need to worry about them, but you do. Do talk about character death. It's one of the biggest problems that we have to talk about on the internet with regard to groups who have somebody's character die. What is the character leveling method? Are you going to be using milestones where you simply have the characters advance at a certain story point or when they complete a particular goal or achieve something? Or are you going to be using experience points where the Dungeon Master will have to assign experience points to goals, quests, social interactions, puzzles, combat, and then tally it up? Are you going to use the average across the group? Are you going to give out experience points individually? Or are you going to use something else completely different that I haven't discussed? So have a discussion about that so that people know, because they will definitely ask you. Are you going to be using retraining options for your player characters, if any? I use retraining. I allow my players to retrain outside of the game. Before the game or after the game, I don't have a problem with that. I have already done a video on how retraining works for me. You're welcome to go and check that out. If you don't want to have retraining, then don't discuss it or make it clear that you're not going to allow adjustments. But I always feel that when players get locked into something, it's often, one, it's boredom, which is dangerous, or two, it's a mistake and they didn't realize they made a mistake and it's too late and they get worried that they can't make adjustments. So therefore, eliminate that problem by just allowing retraining. What are the players' magic item expectations? Really important to discuss. Now, Dungeons & Dragons 5e doesn't really have a lot of magic items. Magic items are rare in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Other versions of the game, it's different. When we were playing Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, there were so many, they were dripping off us. Dungeons & Dragons 4e, even more magic items. In fact, the whole system was built around making sure you had magic items in certain slots. So make sure you understand what your players expect, and then if their expectations aren't what you plan to do, make sure you tell them exactly where you're at with regard to that. What's the availability of magic item shops? Are there going to be any in your world? Dungeons & Dragons 5e doesn't tend to have them, but maybe you are doing things differently. I tend to use magic item shops sparingly. I usually don't present them until much later on in my game, usually beyond level 5, and most of the stuff they can buy in my game worlds are usually consumable. They're not permanent magic items. There isn't a market for that in my world, but you might be doing it slightly different. You need to have a discussion with your players about magic item crafting and creation, because there's bound to be somebody who wants to make magic items. I've already done this, so I don't really allow magic item crafting in my game anymore, because I did it to death, and so I don't use that. But I've already done videos on magic item crafting. You're welcome to go and check those out as well. You have to decide what your system is going to be and make sure your players understand whether that's going to be an option for them or not. So there's quite a lot to discuss with regard to magic items if you hadn't figured out. Okay, this is number 10 on my list. That's the personal group rules. What are the rules in terms of your conduct, your code of behavior at the table, in the game, your etiquette, your table etiquette? What are the taboos? What are the things we are not going to include in the game or we expect not to occur? These are in fact the most important aspect. It's the most important aspect of session 0. All the rest, if I had to pick only one thing that I did during my session 0, that's the thing I would keep. And I know you're probably thinking, well, Fred, if that's the most important thing, why is that not the first thing you said? Well, actually, I did say that. I just didn't say it in that manner. I said it in a slightly different manner. I talked about group health and relationships, and that's really important in your game, so make sure you do it. Number 11, the system of roleplay game. What roleplay game system are you using? What version of Dungeons & Dragons will you be using? I'm going to be using Dungeons & Dragons version 5, so that's what we're playing. So have that discussion. I know a lot of people think, well, that's a no-brainer, that should be pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised. If you've already had these discussions outside of session 0, then you won't need to say them again. But if it needs to be made clear, then make sure you do so, because some people make adjustments to game systems, and so you do actually have to make have a discussion about it. Okay, 12 would be combat presentation. Are you going to be using battle maps and miniatures, or are you going to be using theatre of the mind, where you just use your imagination? Or, like myself, I tend to use a combination of both the battle map and miniatures and theatre of the mind, dependent on my mood and the situation and the complexity of the combat. That's how I approach things. So you need to decide that, let them know. What's the campaign length in real time? Are you going to be running this campaign for 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years, 10 years? Everybody has a busy life. They need to have an idea of how long this campaign will run. What about levels? In terms of the campaign, are you going from level 1 to 20, or level 1 to 10, or are you starting at level 3 and going to finish at level 8? Have that discussion. What is the starting level for your characters? Really obvious stuff, right? Are you starting at level 1, or are you deciding these characters have been around a while, we're going to start at level 3 or level 5? I don't generally talk too much about alignment, but what about the alignment of characters? What alignments can you have? I tend to say in my own games, you can have any alignment, and alignment is not a prescription, it is a description of the character. I want to make that clear for those of you who are wondering how I see that. I've done alignment videos as well, but honestly, I don't allow evil characters. So can they play a good character or an evil character? And if somebody is putting down on their character sheet a particular alignment, I'm going to look at you, chaotic neutral, and think they can do just about anything they like, then you'll need to adjust their alignment, and then you might have to have a discussion with them that this is not the character that I really want to have involved in my campaign, and will the other players accept that? You know, characters don't have to stay in a campaign if people want to play a particular type of character. And there's certainly a tradition in playing the murder hobo, so you need to decide those things in advance. What about your attributes? How will you determine the attributes? Is it going to be standard array where you get a set of numbers and you assign them to your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma? Or are you going to be using the point buy system, or are you going to roll them up? And there are different ways of rolling them up. It's already spelled out in the player's handbook, but other people might, dungeon masters don't necessarily use the roll 4 6-sided dice, drop the lowest. Some people will use the roll 3 dice, and that's what you're going to get. So you got to kind of spell that out to your players so they know what they're getting into. I tend to use the point buy system because it keeps pretty much everybody on the same level. I don't want them sort of having too much disparity. It's hard enough to deal with that as it is. What about hit points? How do you determine your hit points? Is it going to be the class average, or will you be using dice rolling? I generally avoid dice rolling, but you can have your preference to that. I tend to go with the average because I feel like that means that I have a pretty good idea of about how I can scale my encounters over time. Whereas if I have somebody who rolls consistently very low, like 1s and 2s, and therefore has a very, very low pool of hit points, I can't really set up the game for them and somebody else who's doing really well because they keep rolling pretty much an 8 on their 8-sided dice every time they roll their hit points. So that's why I don't use it, but you don't have to do it that way. Have a discussion about your starting wealth and gear. What method will you use? Are you just going to assign them some money based on their class? It's already in the player's handbook. Or are you going to use a package? Or is there going to be additional stuff included? A lot of dungeon masters like to add a few extras just in case, just to make their campaign feel a bit different. I know I have included silvered weapons, particularly if the campaign was using a lot of werewolves or creatures that needed to have silvered weapons, and I knew that they would need them straight off the bat, and you just don't have enough money when you start off to be able to do that. Or I would make sure I would include extra healing potions or healers kits or additional gear, or I might just decide, like, no, it's all right, let's just go straight for the plate mail, because I don't want you to have to constantly be trying to save up money or using the entire group's pool of resources to finally get that shiny plate mail so you can stand in the front line and reduce the chance of getting hit and knocked down, particularly for tanks, right? Okay, so we talked about a lot of stuff. We are getting closer. Number 18 would be have the players build their characters together. It's really important that they do so together, not before the session. It's all right for the players to have a concept, but I really discourage players from trying to start drawing it up in advance because they have not had a discussion with everybody else, And you can't really decide on something until you've sat down and found out what the parameters are of the game. If the Dungeon Master says, well, no, you can't play that race, I'm not going to be allowing the Tabaxi, and I'm not going to be allowing the Artificer in my game, so there's no point in having built that character in advance. So you've just wasted a lot of time. So I know a lot of players don't like this. The type of people who need to be able to sit down and they want to hash it out and they want to crunch numbers and look at all of the options, that's not when you do that. The best time is when you're all together, so you make a character that works in the group rather than as a lone wolf. The discussion about the lone wolf has been discussed so many times in so many videos and so many public forums and community forums that I can't count it. So build the characters together. Players creating a common group background or goal. Now, Acquisitions Incorporated is a good example. They're all part of the same organization, so they all have the same goal. And it doesn't have to be Acquisitions Incorporated. We are a corporation who are going and trying to make money. That's not necessarily how it has to be. In previous campaigns, my group have decided we were all part of the same sort of night. So I believe it was, for the life of me, that's Knights of the Unicorn. That's right. We were all Knights of the Unicorn. We all worked for the same organization, so we had a common background and goal. That doesn't mean that you can't have different backgrounds for your characters. Your players can still have an individual player character background, but they also need to have a common group goal and background to make things a bit smoother. So I would say number 21, roughly. I would say, is it number 21? No, 22. No, 20. Number 20. Players link their characters to each other. Some sort of link between the other characters. Now, it doesn't have to be every single character in the group. It might be just one other character. It might be two. I tend to prefer two links. So if somebody has a character, that they have a relationship of some kind with two other characters at the table. But that is really determined on how many people you have at your table. If you only have one or two people, it's going to be pretty hard to do something like that. But character links are very important. Let's look at things like players determining each other's role. Now, this is actually really important too. You can still have a party completely composed of paladins, but one paladin might be set up more to be the tank, another one might be more to deal with healing, somebody else might be more set up and multi-class to deal with the skill monkey side of things, and somebody else might be a mixture of paladin and sorcerer to cover the mage or the magic user side of things. So the roles are there for a reason. They've been there from the very get-go. I'm still of the belief that players should play the character they want, but you still have to understand that players in a group are simply a different cog in a machine. And if you don't build the machine correctly, it's going to be a bit more difficult. That means that the Dungeon Master needs to make adjustments, or the players need to change the way they play their game to be successful and have hopefully not too many failures as they're working their way through their campaign. Number 22 would be players integrating their characters into the game world. So the Dungeon Master tells the players what the world is like and gives them some meat and potatoes to start with, and the players build a character that will work in that world. So if you're playing in a medieval fantasy world, you don't have somebody trying to build a steampunk character or a fantasy sci-fi character that doesn't work in the world. That's all part and parcel. Currently, my own group, I gave them some background on Phandalin and Salt Marsh, and they actually decided they would all be from Salt Marsh, and they were going to travel to Phandalin, and I'm running currently Dragon of Icespire Peak, but I will be continuing on with Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which I had made completely clear to my players so they knew sort of what they were dealing with. So there's another thing to discuss. Make sure your players are doing that. Complete the character sheets. Now, sometimes it's not possible to sit down and for a player to complete everything. I have a couple of people at the table who sort of struggle with that. Other people who can pump it out in 30 minutes. Other people who can do it in 2 minutes. It really depends on people and how they sort of approach character building. Some people need to spend all week, but the idea is that the character is built and complete when we come to playing the game. Options. Let's talk about different options. What optional rules, variant rules, house rules will you be using? So are you going to be using feats? Are you going to exclude any feats? Is there going to be multi-classing? Is there going to be flanking? These are often conversations that take place. Feats, multi-classing and flanking, probably the most common things to come up, but often a Dungeon Master will have their own house rules. They need to discuss those with the players so they know what they're dealing with. I tend to, with my own group, make it clear that my variant rules and house rules are optional. So you can either use my variant rule or you can use the standard rule that already exists in the core Dungeons & Dragons 5e game. So therefore, I don't need to concern myself too much with people getting upset with my house rules or variant rules, because they are there as an option to utilize if they want, and if they don't like them, they don't need to use them. But you still need to discuss that sort of stuff. Recently, in my own campaign in Session 0, we discussed what source books and materials can be used to build the character. So for me, I decided that the Player's Handbook and Xanathar's Guide to Everything was it. We did exclude, I believe in my own group, the Elven Accuracy feat, just because it is very broken and easily exploited. And we also excluded the Grappler feat from the Player's Handbook because personally, and I think everybody else at the table agreed that it was a piece of garbage. And I wanted people to be able to grapple without having to have a feat. And even though I had a discussion with them about feats and multi-classing, they still wanted to keep feats and multi-classing in the game because they've been playing the game a long time and they prefer those sorts of things. And that's fine, it's all right. So have a discussion with your group about what resources. Often the topic of unearthed arcana comes up, so make sure you have a discussion with your players about that, because there's often the desire, particularly when new unearthed arcana comes out, it's usually overpowered because that's done deliberately by the design team, and therefore if they do it deliberately, it's testing the waters. It's trying to figure out if people will be able to enjoy this and what they need to pull back on. Rather than adding things, they take things away. So they usually give you the whole pizza rather than just one piece of the pizza. Now that we were talking about pizza, we should go on to talking about things like, how is the group food going to be arranged? Is everybody going to bring their own food? Is there going to be a joint food arrangement? Are you going to be playing in a cafe like my own group did many years ago, and they just go and buy their own stuff, or they buy stuff for the group when they feel like it? Figure out your food stuff, because often there's going to be food at your game. Unless, of course, you're playing online, then it's going to be all individual. You might want to add something to Session 0. You might want to change things. You might want to take things away. You don't have to discuss everything. Like I said, honestly, there's only one thing out of all of this that really needs to be discussed in Session 0, and that is the group relationship, your etiquette, your code of conduct, your taboos, those sorts of things. I think they are the most important aspect of Session 0, but you can add other things to your Session 0 if you feel you need to. Now, I'm hoping you found this useful. If you did, fantastic. I have hundreds of videos for players and Dungeon Masters covering pretty much every aspect of the game. You're welcome to go and check those out. I have a series on the Lost Mine of Phandelver and Dragon of Icespire Peak, and there's also a Curse of Strahd series as well if you are interested. I also did a whole bunch of videos on being a lazy dungeon master and just generally dungeon mastering in general. If you want to support the channel so I keep doing stuff like this, I have a Patreon page. I have affiliate links to Amazon and the book depository if you buy stuff online that supports the channel. I have a merchandise shelf underneath my video, and I run ads on my video. So if you don't run an ad blocker, I'd actually get something out of that, which is quite nice. Thank you very much. Otherwise, make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.